Welcome to the Anthropocene, or to be more modest, welcome to the opening ceremony, opening lecture of the Anthropocene project. Welcome on behalf of two partnering institutions of that collaborative project, the Deutsches Museum and the Rachel Carson Center for Environmental Society, both based in Munich, and also welcome on behalf of my co-director at the Rachel Carson Center, Christoph Mauch, who can't be with us tonight but will join us on Saturday. And I use this opportunity to express my deep gratitude to Wolfgang Scherer and Katrin Klingan and their wonderful team who made this exciting event possible. I'm very honored to moderate this opening keynote speech, which is entitled, "The Anthropocene, Where on Earth Are We Going?" Yet we will deal with the future, but we will also deal with the past, because we will raise the question, which is appropriate for an historian like me, we will also raise the question, when on earth did the Anthropocene start? There's a saying among historians that it is the eyewitness who is the worst enemy of a historian. And why is it so? Because it's the eyewitness who claims to possess the real truth on history because he or she was present when history was made. And the eyewitness thus also challenges in a way the interpretive power, the definition power on history of the professional historian. Yet we have a problem here. Here is the eyewitness who watched the birth of the concept of the Anthropocene, as Christian Schwegel already mentioned, and here is the historian. But we're not at all foes, we're friends, we're close friends, at latest since last summer when we met in Stockholm and enjoyed a wonderful evening in a half Turkish, half Lebanese restaurant, enjoyed some wonderful food and discussed the Anthropocene the whole night. And I also learned that very evening, or I should say that we were joined by two other prestigious scholars, Sverker Sörlin from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, who is also with us tonight, I can't see him from here, and Libby Robin, who is based at Australian National University, like Will Steffen is, and Libby Robin was so kind to inform me that at that very day, she sent a manuscript to her publishing house, Cambridge University Press, which will entail a whole series of, let's say, seminal papers on the emergence of the concept of the Anthropocene, like the paper of Vernadsky and others. And this anthology of these papers will end with the paper of the seminal paper of Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer on the Anthropocene, and it is Will Steffen who comments on that paper from his perspective. Libby Robin was so kind to send me that paper, which is still unpublished and will be published in August this year when we will have a big conference in Munich on environmental history. Was so kind to send me that manuscript, and let me quote from that manuscript. For Will, and here this quote starts, it was entirely fitting that the first attempt to define the Anthropocene appeared in the newsletter of the Global Change Research Program, IGBP, International Geosphere Biosphere Program, rather than in one of the mainstream scientific journals. The term was introduced in 2000, as we already heard, by Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer in the newsletter of the IGBP. This publication was a crystallization of Paul Crutzen's first use of the term Anthropocene during a discussion at a meeting of the IGBP Scientific Committee in Cuernavaca, Mexico in February 2000. Scientists from the IGBP's Paleo-Environmental Project were reporting on their latest research, often referring to the Holocene, the most recent geological epoch of Earth's history, to set the context of their work. Paul Crutzen, a vice chair of the IGBP, was becoming visibly agitated at this usage, and after the term Holocene was mentioned yet again, he interrupted them Stop using the word Holocene. We're no more in the Holocene anymore. We are in and he was searching for the right word, we are in the Anthropocene. So this is the story, this is the narrative of the birth of the Anthropocene. And thanks to Will Steffen, we now know where on earth the whole Anthropocene debate started, namely almost 12 years ago in a scientists' meeting in Mexico. In a minute you will see that Will has much more to say on the Anthropocene than just recalling the birth of the Anthropocene. Will is surely the best person we could find for this opening keynote. And Berlin was, in a way, important to him because he was present at many of these Dahlem conferences in the years 2001 and until 2003, when seminal papers and seminal concepts of climate research were inaugurated within these Dahlem conferences, and it was in particular the conference of the year 2003 which spurred him to publish a very well recognized paper which in a way invented the term on the great acceleration, on the great transformation which took place in the 1950s, and he will very much come back to this issue during his talk. Please join me in welcoming Will Steffen. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to Helmut for that very kind introduction. And thank you very much to the House of Culture in the World and other sponsors of this meeting who've kindly invited me to come and talk to you tonight. Well, you've already heard a lot about the Anthropocene, so now it's time to take a tour through the Anthropocene. And we'll do it in three parts. The first will be more on natural science, and it'll be the origins of why we believe we're in a new geological epoch. Then it becomes more interesting because I'm going to move a little bit forward in time and say we're now in the 21st century, and where might we be going? And I'll finish with an interesting mix, I think, of natural science, where I look at Earth as a single system, and the humanities in terms of looking at the human-environment relationship, which is really what the Anthropocene is all about. So let me start, and I'm going to start in my part of the world. That's where I'm going to end too. That is the southern hemisphere. This is Antarctica, the huge, great ice plateau, which holds most of the fresh water on planet Earth. But it also holds some amazing information about Earth history. And to do that, we've got to go right into that ice plateau. It's not an easy place to get to, but scientists do go into that, carry out their research. One of the most interesting things they do is to drill down into the ice. This is actually a small core at the Australian station, but we can now drill several kilometers down into that ice plateau. That's what we pull out, these beautiful, long, elegant cores of ice. And scientists can read them, read layer by layer by layer what Earth history was like. To me, the most important data produced in all of the 20th century in natural science was in fact from Antarctica, and it's that one. It's called the Vostok Ice Core, and it revolutionized our view of how the Earth actually works. For now, I'll return to this later because it's so important. For now, I want to start with just that red curve in the middle. That goes back nearly 500,000 years, and it's a history of Earth's climate in terms of Earth's temperature. You see the regular patterns of warm periods and the long, jagged ice ages. Now, you see what I've put on there. Just putting together data that we have from DNA, from our own bodies, our own remains, and so on. Hominins have been around for a long time, several million years, but us, fully modern humans, that's our whole history in that one single ice core. We evolved about 200, 250 million years ago. The important point I want to make is our DNA is still wired for 90% of that time. We're hunter-gatherers only during that time. We only developed agriculture right at the very end. This last warm period we're in now, that's the famous Holocene that Paul Crutzen objected to. That's it, this bit here. but it's actually already longer than any of the other warmer periods. Let's flip to the northern hemisphere then. This is an ice core from Greenland, much closer to where we are tonight. This is the last 100,000 years, the last ice age, and there is the Holocene, now very clearly shown as an unusually stable period in Earth history of about 10,000 years. Through archaeology and through DNA, we can track how humans got out of Africa about 85,000 years ago and how they've moved around the world. I suspect most of these people in this room have backgrounds that come from Northern Europe. And you would have come from South Asia about 33,000 years ago. The original Australians came from the original movement of people out of Africa and arrived in my country about 60 to 65,000 years ago. Again, only hunter-gatherers until about 10,000 years ago. And then we developed villages, cities, the great Asian, European, African, and American civilizations a few thousand years ago. But this is very, very recent. And we argue that this is the only state in the Earth system that has been stable enough and long enough to allow us to develop. And I'll come back to this later. As my plane left Canberra, I could see on the western horizon thick smoke and red dust as the northwesterly winds blew in fires and dust. And by the time I got the news, when I got to Abu Dhabi, there were a lot of these fires around the country. All of these images come from the last 4 years in Australia. They're all climate-based natural disasters. And they're getting our population to ask the question, what really is going on here? This isn't something that we've really come to expect. We have floods, we have fires in Australia, but not like the ones we've seen. Well, scientists have been looking at these questions for a long time. We looked at them pretty systematically. The first thing that we discovered as we went through this process in IGBP of challenging the concept of the Holocene was that it's much more than climate. This graph here is a graph that comes from the North Atlantic. It's fisheries data going back to the 1800s, and it's the tons of fish that fishermen catch in the North Atlantic. Look at this huge spike after 1950, and then the big crash, down to virtually zero. That's part of the Anthropocene. That's a conversion, a transformation of a major biological system. But we're really land creatures, so we've actually transformed the land much more than the ocean. There's a landscape now that's completely industrialized. It's completely transformed by humans. And even down to the scale of the genetic code of the food we eat, we already changed that too, all the way through the system. One of the things we tried to do then is to become much more systematic and say, all right, let's just look right around the planet and see what's happening. We can look at the big cycles of materials. Nitrogen's an important one. 2 panels, you don't have to go through the detail, simply look at this huge arrow in the bottom one. That is human fixation of nitrogen from the atmosphere, industrially pulling it down. The process was developed here in Germany. It carries the name of Haber-Bosch. And it's the way in which we can make fertilizers to support 8 and soon 9 billion people. That's the Anthropocene. But it goes on. That's the number of large dams around the world. And the fact that I think you've already heard that we divert 50% of the fresh water that flows into the ocean. Those are landscapes around the world in which a significant fraction is cultivated. Those are anthromes. Those are the ones that have a lot of cultivation, cropland. There are other anthromes not shown there, which are grazed lands. But most of the Earth's land surface has already been significantly influenced by humans. And of course, we have climate. There's a very, very large cyclone moving in on Australia. And you can see it's about 1/3 of the size of the continent. And of course, we have the iconic graph that you've seen so many times, which is the temperature record at the surface of the Earth. Over the last 50 or 60 years, you see the trend going upwards. All of that together is global change. Well, when I was with IGBP, that project that Paul Crutzen was also with, we undertook what we called a synthesis, tried to put all this knowledge together, which was very fragmented at that time. This was the late 1990s. And one of the things that I decided we should do is go back to before the Industrial Revolution and map it all on the same scale. So I'm going to show you a whole lot of graphs. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but this is what they do. They go from 1750 to 2000. And all of the variables that go upwards, whether they're a human activity or part of the environment, are all what we call a linear scale, okay? We don't use the scientific tricks of logarithmic scales or things like that. So let's go now to 12 of those that are about human activity. Oh, I should add, look at this year. You've already heard the term great acceleration. Well, that popped out of the graphs I'm going to show you. It surprised us when we plotted them. So here we go. On the left, you see the sort of things we looked at. Types of human activities from economy, population, transport, communication, very importantly, resource use, resource consumption. There are the graphs in exactly the style that I showed you. You don't have to look at them in detail, but look at the shape. They're all the same, they're all dramatic, and 1950 stands out in each one. So the Great Acceleration is an amazing phenomenon. These are global aggregates. That was actually driven by 20% of the population, by the way, although these are global aggregates. We then move to the natural world, and these are also global aggregates. And there you see again the list. We looked at greenhouse gases, ozone depletion. We looked at ecosystems. We looked at big element cycles. We looked at biodiversity. We looked at land systems. Now look at those graphs. They're not quite so neat and clean as the human activities because there are buffers and there are lags in the global environment. Some of them you can certainly see the effects of the Great Acceleration directly, and others not so directly. But one point I want to make, each of those is demonstrable in two ways. One is everything you see there has been driven by human activities, and we have heaps of evidence for that. That is not natural variability. Number two, in each one of those, the Earth system has been pushed out of the Holocene pattern of the last 10,000 years. So this then, in my view, is the best coherent set of evidence of the fact that we have left the Holocene and we've moved into the Anthropocene. So this is really what natural science is telling us. Now I want to go back to the Great Acceleration for a moment, because the impact of that, of course, has been enormous. And there have been some analyses of what is driving that, and some of them get quite complex. Some of the best ones come from the historians. I want to use a very simple one here. It's pretty crude, but it tells you a good story. That is, the impact is just an aggregate of three things: population, affluence, which is a measure of consumption, and technology. Now this diagram, which came out of National Geographic, if you look at these axes, there we have the three. There's population, there's technology, and there's affluence. Now it's maybe hard to see up the back of the room here, but there's a little box right in the bottom. I'm showing it to you right here. That is 1900. That's the total sum of the human enterprise in 1900. That's not so long ago. Most of you can remember your grandparents, and they were around in 1900 and before. Now, the interesting thing is, when National Geographic published this, they had that one square in here, then they had the whole box. And they sent it to me for review. I said, wait a minute, you've actually missed the most interesting point of all. And I had to argue with them. I said, put in 1950. I didn't tell them why. I just said, put in 1950, and you'll see. Well, this next little box is 1950, a 50-year time frame. At the end of the Second World War, that's what the human enterprise looked like. Wasn't very much bigger than 1900. Well, here we are today. This is the size of the box a little over half a century later, in 2011. This box, if you can see it, is filled with airplanes, fridges, cars, trucks. It's all the stuff we consume. That is the Great Acceleration, crawling up from 1900 to 1950, and then the explosion to 2011. The best image I've ever seen of the Great Acceleration. Now, before we leave the science part, I want to start putting this together with the so-called human dimensions. This is an interesting curve, a little bit complex, but it's got environment, global impact coming up here. And it's just measured of the impact of each human, how many hectares of land and ocean we consume because of the food and other materials we eat and use, and the waste we produce. This is human well-being. Now we're looking at ourselves. And the reason we use a lot of resources is we want to improve our well-being. So the trick is to get over here where you're far enough along to have a high level of human well-being, but you're low enough on your impact that you still haven't consumed more than your share of the Earth's resources. Here's the whole human dilemma of the Anthropocene. We want to improve the lot of people, and most of these are African countries down here. We want to get them over here where the human well-being is sufficient. However, to do that, we can start consuming more and more, and we miss the Sustainable Development Quadrant. There's the United States up there. Most of Europe is the green. So this is the problem we face in the Anthropocene, is that we have a desire to bring still many more than half of the world's population out of poverty, and yet we're already consuming more than one planet Earth. This is, again, the dilemma of the Anthropocene. So let's now go to phase 2. Let's look ahead. And it's really hard to say how this is going to all turn out. The optimists say, well, we know how to handle this. We're improving all the time, getting better technologies, bringing people out of poverty. We have a bright future on the left, full of fun and fireworks. This is, by the way, not a photoshopped image. It's a real image. On the right-hand side are the people saying, wait a minute, if I look off here in the horizon, there's a big storm coming, and it could be very difficult. So this is the problem we face as we look forward. Now, whenever I tend to have these problems, if I really don't know what's going to happen in the future, I actually turn to my colleagues in the history area, because it's always useful to look in the past to get very important insights to the future. Now, we're doing this more systematically globally in a project called I-HOPE, which is Integrated History and Future of People on Earth, saying, look at past civilizations. They've come and gone. We have lots of elegant records of societies which thrived in very different parts of the world. And then sometimes, or many times, fairly rapidly, they disappeared, they collapsed. And the people dissipated and had to redevelop somewhere else. And I'll just give you a few quick examples. I won't go through in detail, but the point I want to make here is you just look at this rich array. This brings together science, and a lot of these graphs are the language of science. I like to look at them and I can understand them. But they're telling something about the environment, and they're telling something about how people interacted with the environment. And our historian colleagues are providing rich narratives of how people lived during these times. It's an example of the Greenland Norse, which had a lot of study, particularly in the Scandinavian countries. Of course, a very famous one is the Roman Empire in terms of Europe. And again, we have an enormous amount of data, some really interesting data about a thing called the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is an important part of climatic variation that affects Germany and other parts of Europe, and how that affected the Roman Empire. This is an interesting one. This is the southwest of present-day United States. And these are some indigenous North American societies. And the message here is they all were in the same basin. They all felt the same environmental pressure, which is mainly a pressure of very dry times, extreme droughts. But when you analyze what happened to them, and here are 3 different societies, if you can read that up the back, they all went through major cultural change. They had to. Some of them, though, had very little physical suffering. They transformed themselves in a positive way, whereas others had major transformations, but they were forced on them with violence, horrible health, violence here. 2 collapsed, 1 transformed. Same environmental pressure. This is telling us that the answer isn't just in the environmental pressure that we face. It's in ourselves, our societies, how we organize ourselves, the values that we have. And this is why, to understand the future, you need much more than natural science. You need the humanities as well. There's some explanations of what societies were like. Here are 3 scholars, Joe Tainter, Friedman, Jared Diamond, and they have varying explanations. One is we become too complex and we lose resilience. That could be happening to our societies. Just go through any airport security system and you'll see how complex we've become in terms of responding to terrorism threats. Friedman says we just expand ourselves like the Romans, waves of globalization bigger and bigger until we hit an upper limit in which the systems collapse inwards because they simply can't be maintained. Jared Diamond, I think, has the most interesting one. When our core values of our societies become dysfunctional and we don't recognize that, then we're in trouble. And that's, I think, one of the things we're facing now. Core values, particularly in Western societies, are built around economic growth and continuing consumption. Is this now becoming dysfunctional? Well, we don't know. I want to quote one of my colleagues here. In fact, he's at the meeting, Sverker Solan. This is, I think, an exceptionally important comment that he made, because most of the narratives we hear today in modern societies are one of ever more progress, more technology, and so on and so on. But if you actually look at history, this is what Sverker and Paul Ward said. And what I've highlighted in red is really important, I think. That our history is actually marked by crises, regime shifts, disasters, and constantly changing patterns of adjustment to limits and confines. This is really what human history is telling us. We have to be resilient. We have to be adaptive. Our definitions of progress may have to change. We may need to transform. We've always done that. And are we capable of doing that in the 21st century? What 21st century, where are we going? Well, other countries are starting their great accelerations, China, India, Brazil, and so on. The world is reaching an exceptional level of connectivity, hyperconnectivity, global financial crisis, for example. We're reaching peaks, peak oil, peak phosphorus. Resources are now a real issue. I like this last one, because it says we've constructed an artificial chromosome, the actual basis of life, and we've inserted it into the DNA of a bacterium, and it's actually worked. So we are on the verge of synthesizing life itself. Now, the point I want to make here is that it's taken hundreds of millions of dollars of research to do that, and hundreds of scientists in labs around the world to do that, to make one chromosome and one lousy bacterium. At the same time, we're forcing the 6th great extinction rate in Earth history. The huge, rich genetic library that's already there is being lost at an alarming rate. Here's one of these science tricks of putting a so-called logarithmic vertical scale. Each step there is a factor of 10. That's extinction rate. There's the distant past, the background level. Here's where we are now, the recent past, the last century. And here's where we're probably going. Factor of 1,000 to 10,000 more than the natural background rate. That's an enormous loss of genetic library. And at the same time, we're putting hundreds of millions of dollars into maybe making one bit of one bacterium. You've got to wonder about the values of societies that actually do that. Peak oil. Well, here's what the experts in the industry have to say about what's happening. We've probably virtually hit it as we sit here between 2010 and 2015. There's only one optimistic scenario left, and that's probably not going to happen. So we're really running low on resources. This is important. This is what happens to oil prices when you start hitting a case where supply is going like that and demand, particularly with China and India coming in line, going like that. You get price spikes. Why is that important? There's the oil price from about the year 2000 to 2011. Big price spike about 2008, 2009. I've put now on exactly the same timeline the world food price as a commodity. Look at the correspondence. It's pretty close, isn't it? So we depend entirely on liquid fossil fuels really to drive our globalized food system for 8 billion people. There's been an analysis of that food crisis from a systems perspective. It's actually more interesting than simply oil. But in fact, there is a single powerful global shock that hits the system. Because of the connectivity, it propagates very fast through the world system. And then we start getting management effects. Example being Russia stopping exporting food because it wants to contain prices domestically. And that sends further shocks through the system. We expect to see more of these as we hit resource constraints in a very connected world. That'll be part of the Anthropocene in the 21st century. Okay, third part of the talk. Let's now talk a little bit about Earth as a system. Because I think it's very important that we now start putting all these pieces together. This has been hard for natural science. We've been very fragmented over hundreds of years of development of natural science. Physicists, chemists, physical chemists, biochemists, organic chemists, inorganic chemists, and so on and so on. It goes on and on. Very fragmented. We now have to put this together into a systems perspective to understand what's going on. I told you I'd return to this Antarctic ice core because now we really see Earth as a system. What I want to show here is, again, look at the pattern here of oscillation of Earth between short warm periods, long deep cold periods, and so on. But now we'll start looking at the other bits too, the CO2 and the methane. Before we do that, let's just now have a look at that regular pattern. So basically, a complex system scientist would say there are two states. There's a cold state, which is actually the more stable one. That lasts for a long time. and it's very stable. Every so often, in fact regularly, every 100,000 years, the Earth gets kicked out of it, and we move into so-called interglacial or warm state. So it oscillates between those two. It has a very regular period of oscillation between two and only two states. Remember, this is our world. This is where humans evolved. This is what we're wired for. This is what our genetic code, our bodily physiology is actually designed for a cold world and no more than this temperature. I'll return to that too. Now, these are the other two curves, carbon dioxide, methane, two greenhouse gases. Look how closely their patterns correspond to temperature. All right, there's very close correspondence for obvious reasons. But now let's look at what we call limit cycles. If you look at CO2, it varies between tightly constrained limits of about 180 and 280 parts per million. Every ice age, it goes down to about the same level. Every warm period, up to the same level. Same thing for methane. Same thing for temperature. This is absolutely characteristic of a well-regulated complex system with lots of feedbacks that actually regulate it and control it. Not a surprise. Well, that blue arrow up there is where we are now with CO2. It's drawn to the right scale. Okay? There's methane, that green arrow you can sort of see coming off to the right. Look how far out of the limit cycle we already are. This is why natural scientists are really worried about what the Anthropocene really means once the Earth gets to another state. And of course, we think temperature is going to respond, and it is responding. Here's a 2,000-year temperature record. This goes back to the Roman Empire. And you see natural variability. And then you see this red line. That's the greenhouse gas-driven warming that we've seen in the last century or so. Already we're above the last 2,000 years, and we're headed upwards. You've seen some projections for where we might be going in the future. Those are the so-called climate model, or IPCC, temperature projections. And you see many curves like this, somewhat reassuring. They're nice, smooth curves. They don't look terribly frightening. And they all stop at 2100, simply because they think our interest drops off at 2100. The climate certainly doesn't. And it's more frightening when you look at what happens after that. But what I want to do now is put this on the same time scale. This is only 200 years. I want to put it on a 2,000-year time scale because it's very informative. There's the 2,000-year time scale I just showed you, from the year 200 to about the year 2000. Now we put those projections on the same scale. They look like that. Okay, same curves I showed you, but now moved, that's about 2100 there. So, here's where we are now, this top of this red curve, just outside the patterns of variability. This, by the way, is where our civilizations really evolved, our contemporary one. Our agriculture is designed for this temperature range. So are our ecosystems. Well, we're just now going out of that. But that's what we're in store for the rest of this century. This, by the way, about 5 degrees, is the same change as between an ice age and a warm period. Okay? It takes the Earth at least 5,000 years to go between an ice age and a warm period. This is only in 100. So this is a real severe challenge to us, and challenge to our ecosystems, to the services that we get from ecosystems. So that's why some people say, well, the worst case scenario, can contemporary society really survive this? And it's a really good question. But there's, I think, another implication. That's to go back to this idea of a complex system. Complex systems like the Earth, like what we've seen in the last 450,000 years, don't go all over the place. They exist in well-defined states, like the Ice Age and the Warm Period. So there's a growing body of work that is understanding the feedbacks that keep the Earth within a state or drive it to a new one. And so the question is, there is something to this 2-degree guardrail you may have heard about. There are a lot of potential impacts that are going to be difficult. But most scientists think that if we keep the Earth under a 2 or 2.5 degree temperature rise, it will eventually come back down to a Holocene-like state. There's enough feedbacks to pull it down. Absorption of carbon by land, by ocean, and so on. But there may well be a tipping point somewhere around 3 or 4, where suddenly the feedbacks turn the other way. They start pushing the Earth to another state, or in the terminology of complex systems, another attractor. So the problem there is we may not see the temperatures in between. If we cross that tipping point, and that's a tipping point for the Earth as a whole, not for parts of it, but for the whole Earth, we may see the Earth go into a very much hotter state, one that humans have never existed in, and our physiology isn't built for, and one which may eventually become ice-free. Now, is this fanciful? Well, the answer is no. Again, you have to look at the past to understand the future. If you go back in Earth history a little bit farther, to 30 million years ago, 40 million years ago, 50 million years ago, the Earth was ice-free. It was very hot, CO2 was very much higher, and we were in the land of ages of the dinosaurs. Reptiles loved it, mammals didn't. Okay? We had a slow cooling, which was very good for us, and it was only about 30-some million years ago we started to get the first ice sheet in Antarctica. This state of the Earth system is well known in the past, it's stable, and it can last for millions of years. So it's not just a question of whether it's 2, 3, or 4, and oh well, we'll cope if we go up to that. The Anthropocene may lead us to a quite different Anthropocene, one that is much longer than many geologists may reckon on, but it comes from thinking of the Earth as a complex system. Well, let me close then by talking a little bit about what we might do about this and about the human-environment relationship. Well, the idea of planetary boundaries has come about the last 3 or 4 years to say, if we look at the Earth as a complex system, if we look at thresholds, tipping points, and so on, we may want to put boundaries around the Anthropocene in a way that will keep it in a Holocene-like state. We identified 9 such processes in the Earth. Climate change is an obvious one, you see it there. Some of the others may surprise you. But we think this combination of 9 is probably sufficient to define the state of the Earth system. And then we looked at each one of those and said, if we want to keep the Anthropocene close to what the Holocene looked like, and in fact, let it relax back down into the Holocene, then where would we put these boundaries? And we were able to estimate for 7 of the 9. That's what those red wedges coming out are. That green circle in the middle is a Holocene-like state. So this is what the Anthropocene looks like. At the moment, it's messy. In some parts of the Anthropocene, some parts of the Earth system, we're already way outside a Holocene bound. The rate of biodiversity loss I already mentioned. It's huge compared to the natural background rate. Here's climate change. We think we're already too far outside the range. Here's the nitrogen cycle. Others, we're pushing outwards, but we're still within the Holocene. This is a snapshot of the Anthropocene and what it looks like now from a natural science perspective. How are humans reacting? The most fascinating thing to me as a natural scientist is for most of the time that I've been grappling with the Anthropocene, it's been a concept, a term, an idea used almost entirely in the natural science world, up until a few years ago. And now it's hit the public. And now we talk about the lost world of the Anthropocene. And it made the cover of Le Monde, a well-known French magazine. There's a bit of cultural insight here if you look at this. How do you think the French would view the world? Well, something to eat, of course. The French are well known for their cuisine, and there's a portly Frenchman who has eaten his way through a fair bit of the Earth. That's their view of the Anthropocene. Well, there's the American view. Age of man, bigger and better. Yeah, we're on the way to really taking over this place and showing how we can run it. Again, culture comes through, interestingly, in how people conceive of, or even present visually, what the Anthropocene is, what it means to them. And of course, you know you've really made it in the world when you get on the front cover of The Economist. Because that's the really serious stuff if you make it there. And so indeed, a couple of years ago, we were welcomed by The Economist, and that made it official that Anthropocene actually exists. But I think the interesting thing here is how people view the human-environment relationship. This comes from one of my Australian papers on the 100th anniversary of the Titanic. And here we are having great parties. If you can sort of see in those portholes, everyone's dancing and carrying on and so on. And the crew are saying, relax, we're indestructible. And of course, there are some Anthropocene-like warning signs on the sea out in front of us. My colleague, Catherine Richardson from Copenhagen, I think had some really good insights. And she said science has had a history of shocking human societies and shocking our view of ourselves in the natural world. A good recent example of a couple centuries ago is, in fact, Charles Darwin and his insights about the origins. And he sort of said, wait a minute, we're not above nature. We're not a specially created creature. We're an ape. We're another ape. Pretty clever ape with opposable thumbs and fingers and a fairly big brain, but we're an ape. Now that really challenged some deeply held beliefs and still does in some parts of the world. So that's what science does. It did it earlier with Galileo, of course, and Copernicus. The question is, will the Anthropocene evoke a similar level of deep emotion in the public? And I can tell you it really is. I go around, spend part of my time in Australia with a thing called the Climate Commission. And we engage the Australian public in forums like this on climate and other Anthropocene-type issues. But most of the time, they're asking questions of us. And I can tell you it's challenging some deeply held beliefs of some Australians about their place in the world, the role of their society in the world, and so on. Here it really is, can we really affect the whole Earth? It's so huge. You know, we've lived on here for 200,000 years and things are going, pretty well. Have no problems at all with the Earth. Can we really do that? We're so puny. But what then does it mean for our definition of progress? And that gets back to something we were talking about earlier in terms of past societies. It challenges our belief system and what we think is important and how humans continue to develop and societies continue to develop. But I think to really get some perspectives on the Anthropocene and where we're going and on human-environment relationships, again, I like to go back to the past. Religion is interesting because it's long had a tradition of looking at the human-environment relationship. Now, I can't cover all, but here are three major religions. There's Christian religion, and a passage from Revelation, hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees. Very similar in Islamic religion. There's talk there about nature and man, the nature around man, not man above nature, the nature around man. Balance, goodness, care are the laws of his world. And of course, the most poetic would have to come from Buddhism. Without the willow, how to know the beauty of the wind? It's all connected. But I'm going to finish my talk tonight, as I promised, by going back down to the southern hemisphere. So there we are. This is northern Australia, a place called Arnhem Land, ancient landscape. Not far away, you'll find surface rocks that are 3.5 billion years old, the oldest surface rocks that you can find on planet Earth. It is a very old place, very beautiful place in terms of its ecosystems, and it has remnants of the dinosaur age. And those creatures that's come through pretty much unchanged, 65, 70, 80 million years, are there in numbers, and they are quite dangerous to humans. It's a reminder that we haven't always been masters of the planet. They're still there, pretty resilient creatures. But the interesting thing I want to point out is that we've had a civilization there, a society, that's been pretty resilient for 65,000 years in the same environment, probably the longest continuously operating civilization on Earth. Very rich in art and very wise in how they view the human-environment relationship. So the last one I want to close with is from Indigenous Australians. And if you read that passage as you go out into the Australian landscape, it's quite clear why we're going out into that landscape from their point of view. We're a tool in the cycle of things. Look at their use of the word cycle twice. They actually understood material cycles. They understood biogeochemistry before we scientists even invented the word. Balance of nature. It's a big cycle of living with the land and then eventually going back to it. So where are we going? I can't answer that question. I don't think anybody can. We could have a bright future, but there are a lot of warning signs out there. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to talk about this tour of the Anthropocene. It's fascinating. We're living through it, and we don't know where it's going to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you for an excellent talk, breathtaking information, and thought-provoking interpretations. I've been asked to prepare a couple of questions to elaborate on one of the most exciting points you were tipping. But for reasons of time, I only want to focus on one question, and that is, what do you think? What do we need in terms of knowledge production in order to cope with all the problems we've been causing, which led us to the Anthropocene? So what kind of knowledge production? How can we bring together different modes of knowledge, be it the natural sciences, be it the cultural sciences, be it perhaps arts as a mode of knowledge production, in order to be prepared to face the challenges of the Anthropocene?
You left the toughest question, I think, for me to actually deal with. We've got to do a couple of things. One is, you mentioned it already, we've got to get over these disciplinary boundaries, not only within the humanities, within social science, within natural science, but across them. Now, there are a couple of things you have to do. One is you have to spend a lot of time learning each other's language and concepts. We've actually gone off on some very different directions. They need to be brought together. Second is you need to formulate the questions and problems together. So many times I see natural scientists formulating a question, getting to a point and saying, oh my God, we need a social scientist or whatever, and say, hey, can you come in and help us? It doesn't work. You actually need to throw the ideas around together from the beginning. That's one part. The second big part is knowledge now needs to be co-produced with people who are outside the knowledge production business. That sounds crazy. But there's a good example of it in Australia recently, where the Prime Minister of Australia formed a committee to deal with the climate change issue. And on her committee, she had 7 politicians, including herself as the chair, but 4 people from knowledge-producing enterprises. I was the only natural scientist, but we had an economist, we had an engineer, and we had a social scientist. We co-produced what I think is one of the best packages to deal with climate change that's been produced yet, because it dealt with climate change in terms of a pretty comprehensive price on carbon. But simultaneously, it integrated social equity issues. How are the poor people in Australia going to deal with higher electricity prices? Well, that led into we fixed the tax system. Then we worked on the biology. We worked on, well, wait a minute, if you don't do this right, you're going to wipe out more biodiversity by putting in biofuels. We solved that with a number of other things. We co-produced, I think, a really interesting bit of knowledge which went into policy. So I think the other aspect is you need to co-produce knowledge with people who are involved in using that knowledge and developing it further.
Well, again, please join me in thanking Will for taking the burden of coming all the way from Canberra to us to inform us, and thanks for a wonderful talk. Thank you.